This is 16.3 about Darwin's theory of natural selection, the essence of the evolutionary theory. You remember Malthus, Captain Doomsday, and you remember that Darwin read the information about human populations and applied that to other populations. He saw that in most species, reproduction is too much than would actually survive. So members of a population have to compete in order to survive to adulthood, to pass on their genes. This is called the struggle for existence. That's what Darwin called it. Darwin knew that there were different individuals that had different traits. There's variation among species, and what he hypothesized is that some of those variants were better adapted to their environment than others. These are called adaptations. Anything that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce is called an adaptation. Got several examples for you here. You have body parts or structures. You have colors like camouflage or mimicry. We'll do some examples there. Physiological functions like photosynthesis in a plant. The scarlet king snake exhibits mimicry. Scarlet king snake is harmless, but its coloring, which you'll see on the next slide, is almost exactly like the poisonous eastern coral snake. So predators don't take their chances, they stay away from both. A scorpion fish, which you'll see on the next slide, is camouflaged. It's blending into its background. This is the time in the year in biology where you're going to start to hear things that you've heard before. I bet you talked about camouflage before. I bet that you may have even learned about mimicry in past science classes. So this is where I'm not going to promise that it's going to get easier, but things will sound a little bit more familiar and we'll get into greater depth. There are also behaviors like avoidance strategies that prey species use. So let's take a look. Right here on the left, this is the coral snake and the king snake. The coral snake, or the king snake is here. Red on yellow, hurt a fellow. And the coral snake is here. I hope I got that right. The king snake is harmless. The coral snake is poisonous. So yeah, so the king snake is harmless right here. And the coral snake is poisonous. Red on yellow, hurt a fellow. Red on black, you're okay, Jack. Something like that. Mr. Bond taught me that the other day. And then we have our scorpion fish blending into its surroundings. It kind of looks coralish. So you can see what that looks like, an example of camouflage. Fitness, important word here on this slide. How well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. So individuals with adaptations that help them survive and reproduce have high fitness. Ones that don't have low fitness. Tomorrow we're going to consider a couple of different topics. We're going to consider roadkill and we're going to consider professional athletes. And I'm going to give you this evolution talk, I guess, in the context of those. And hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. So fitness is where we get the phrase, and you probably have heard it before, survival of the fittest. Fitness is how well an organism can survive and reproduce. So survival of the fittest is sort of redundant, actually. Natural selection is what Darwin termed this mechanism because he was comparing it to artificial selection that we talked about in 16.2, where I talked about my tomatoes and how I select for the ones hopefully that are going to ripen earliest in the summer. I showed you the picture of those crazy pigeons. And all of those different things are artificial selection that we humans do to make animals, plants better. Natural selection is what he sees, what he observed out in nature. So the environment is influencing fitness, not a farmer or an animal breeder. Since it's as simple as this. Well-adapted individuals survive and reproduce. Those are the genes that get passed on to the next generation. Here's an example. What you can see here, you got a population of grasshoppers in the drawing. Grasshoppers are going to change over time as a result of natural selection. So we have variation in the species. You have some brown grasshoppers and some green grasshoppers, as you can see in the picture here. Some green, some brown. And these guys overproduce. 200 eggs at a time, but only a small fraction of those survive to pass on their genes. So what makes them able to pass on their gene? We have adaptations, like we said, increase an individual's chances of surviving and reproducing. And like I said, well, I said I said green and brown. I guess this is yellow and green. So green color is an adaptation. In this case, they're blending in. So it's camouflage. Green grasshoppers blend into their environment. The yellow grasshoppers do not. They're more obvious to predators. So what we see happening over time, green grasshoppers are camouflaged. They have higher fitness. They have a higher likelihood of passing on their genes because we see that the predators, in this case the birds, prey first upon the grasshoppers that stand out, the yellow grasshoppers. Green grasshoppers survive, they reproduce, they pass on their genes, so you see a shift in a population towards green. Green grasshoppers are surviving, passing on their genes. Green grasshopper babies are born more frequently than yellow grasshopper babies. This slide talks about how this is a completely random process. Adaptations don't have to be perfect, just good enough for the genes to be passed on to the next generation. There's not one perfect way that natural selection happens. It depends on the environment. Natural selection is a process that happens. It enables organisms to survive and reproduce in a local environment. Different styles of pollination are some examples when we're talking about plants. Some are wind pollinated, some are insect pollinated. Some plants get pollinated both ways. As long as that allows the species, the individuals in that species, to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation, that's okay. This is what we see happening now. With quick changes in the environment, local environmental changes, some traits that were adaptive might not any longer be useful, and then you'll see a shift in the population. So natural selection depends on the abilities of organisms to reproduce and leave descendants. Every organism alive today has parents who survived and reproduced. So what we see is that well-adapted species will survive over time. Over time also, adaptation could cause successful species to evolve into new species. And what he saw on the Galapagos Islands with the finches and the tortoises made him wonder if they were all somehow linked together. And when he was looking at living species and how they are similar to one another, he proposed that perhaps more than just certain tortoises or certain birds had a common ancestor, that a greater variety of living things are all descended from a common ancestor. So this is called descent with modification. Obviously, there are descendants. There are changes over time according to the rules of natural selection. And according to the principle of common descent, Darwin says all species living and extinct are descended from ancient common ancestors. And again, let me just remind you, nobody was there. We don't know. This is just a hypothesis. This goes along with Hutton's and Lyell's theories, studies, hypotheses. This all had to take a really long time for every organism to be descended from a common ancestor. Had to take a long time for this evolution process to happen. For evidence of descent with modification, Darwin looked at fossils. We're going to look at some other examples as well, but Darwin looked at fossils. What we see with descent with modification and with Darwin's theory is if you take a look at organisms and the fossil record, you can see some evidence of what he was trying to say. So Darwin based his explanation on the idea that species change over time. This is a page from one of Darwin's notebooks that shows the first evolutionary tree that was ever drawn. So he was trying to put together the story of how different organisms were related to one another. And what this is saying is that a single tree of life links all living things. That's what he was trying to figure out in this drawing.